Nightmare. My name is Alex, and I've resided in Meadowbrook Estates for 15 years. My home is on 3 acres of property that borders a small lake. I've spent thousands of dollars and countless weekends making this place my own little paradise. My favorite area is the meadow that slopes down to the water full of native wildflowers, a few old oak trees and a twisting stone walkway. I put in myself. I was returning from the grocery store when I saw that something was off a line of cars pulling into my private driveway. Initially, I figured they had taken a wrong turn, but as I drove nearer, my stomach dropped. There were at least 20 cars parked across my meadow, and more coming by the minute. "Hey, what's going on here?" I shouted to a valet in a red vest who was guiding a Mercedes SUV onto my property. "We're managing parking for the Martinez party next door," he replied nonchalantly as if this were totally routine. I rushed inside, dumped my groceries on the counter, and marched right over to my neighbor's house. Eleanor Martinez's mansion was adorned with pink balloons and a huge Sweet 16 banner music thumped out of costly speakers and teens, dressed to the nines, congregated at the entrance. Eleanor had seen me before I even had a chance to ring her doorbell. She was dressed in a designer outfit and possessed that great smile that never really reached her eyes. "Alex, it's so great to see you," she said, holding me up at her door, relishing the fine weather. "Why are there dozens of cars parked on my property?" I asked, trying to maintain my voice level. Eleanor's smile did not falter. "Oh, we're having Sophia's Sweet 16 today. Didn't you receive the HOA notice?" "What notice?" She rummaged through her purse and took out a creased paper. "The HOA approved us temporary easement for overflow parking. President Marlowe signed it this morning. See," she gestured to a rushed signature at the end. I read over the document, my rage growing line by line. I never signed on to this. Nobody called me while the board made the decision. Nothing you can do till tomorrow. Eleanor's pretentious sympathy made me see red. It's just for today, and Sophia has so many friends. Where else would everyone park like they're on cue, a Porsche? Cayenne rode across my flower garden, destroying the black-eyed Susans I had put in last spring. Those vehicles must be relocated. Now I insisted. Eleanor's courteous facade cracked for an instant. "Look, all of the respectable families in Meadowbrook are here. Judge Wilson's son, Dr. Patel's daughters, even Mayor Collins brought in his twins. You quite want to cause a disturbance." A group of parents looked over at us. Champagne glasses in hand, "This wasn't approved by me," I said firmly. "And that document doesn't outline which areas of my property they can utilize." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Don't be obstinate, Alex. It's only for a few hours." She turned away, calling out to new arrivals and effectively shutting me out. I returned to my property, recording the damage with my phone. Tire tracks cut through my well-manicured grass. Someone had upended the stone bird bath beside my oak tree. A teenager sat on my private dock with his feet dangling in the water. Texting by evening, 57 cars had rummaged my land. I tallied each one, taking pictures of license plates, and damaged music and laughter wafted across the lake until far past midnight while I sat in my darkened living room looking up HOA bylaws on my computer. What I learned caused my hands to shake with outrage. The easement needed written permission from the landowner, me. The paper Eleanor had waved in front of my face was incomplete and potentially fraudulent. And most significantly, I uncovered a clause that would be the bedrock of my reply. Sunday morning brought stillness and the withdrawal of the majority of the cars, but 7 automobiles remained haphazardly parked throughout my meadow. Their owners had clearly had too good a time at the party to drive home. I stood in my window and watched as Eleanor came out of her house in a silk robe, coffee cup in hand. She looked over the remains with satisfaction, never once glancing in the direction of the destruction of my property. That's when I realized this wasn't just about one party, that this was a matter of power and privilege. Eleanor had purposefully employed her status on the HOA board to override my property rights. She believed that her social connections made her immune. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Monday morning broke with grim resolve as I reached for my phone and called HOA President Marlowe's number. My meadow still had 7 cars whose owners hadn't even taken the trouble to come back in through my kitchen window. I could see whole tracks cutting across my alias and champagne bottles bobbing in my koi pond. "Alex, what can I do for you this morning?" Marlowe's cheerful voice grated on my already frayed nerves. "You can tell me why you authorized parking on my property without my approval, I responded bluntly. Pause. Eleanor said that you'd orally agreed, but had been out of town to sign the documents. And considerable harm to landscaping. I'm confident that Eleanor will correct this, he said hastily. She's a respected board member, quite philanthropic with time and contributions. That last word stopped me. Contributions, another hesitation to the community. Obviously, just last month, she gave $10,000 to landscaping finance. The pieces fell into place. Eleanor's largesse had purchased her influence. The timing was not an accident. I'll want a full report on this matter by end of day, I said curtly before hanging up. My follow-up call was to an attorney friend who specialized in property lawsuits. After hearing the whole story, she had good news for me. They've gone too far, Alex. The HOA does not have a right to provide access to your private land without full consent, particularly not for a private gathering document, and email those pictures to me by lunch. I'd compiled an extensive report of the damaged flattened plants, tire tracks in the yard, trampled flower beds, oil spots on my path, and trash scattered about the meadow. My estimate to make repairs totaled over $3,000. But reviewing the HOA covenants is where I found my opening section. 7.4 explicitly read unauthorized vehicles parked on private property more than 24 hours could be dealt with at owner's option after notification was documented. I printed 7 formal notices, each in a bright orange envelope, and put one on every windshield notice. This vehicle is illegally parked on private property unless removed by 5 p.m. Wednesday will be deemed abandoned and subject to removal at owner's expense. Then I called 3 crucial phone numbers, one to a towing firm, one to a buddy who does auctions, and one to lease portable fencing. By Tuesday afternoon, word had spread across Meadowbrook Estates. I was weeding what was left of my flower bed when Eleanor stormed across her lawn towards me, designer heels sinking into the soft ground with each furious step. Take down those silly notices at once, she demanded, face flushed with rage. That blue Porsche is owned by my daughter's boyfriend and the others by board members' children. I slowly straightened up garden gloves in dirt. The notices unequivocally declare cars need to be removed by 5 p.m. Tomorrow. I'm just following HOA protocol paperwork and notification. This is utterly unreasonable. Eleanor's tone escalated, drawing a reaction from another neighbor taking his dog for a walk. It was just a party I never gave permission on my property. I set her straight. Your guest caused thousands in damages. Eleanor's expression changed to one of reasoned calculation. I'm certain we can come to some arrangement. The HOA maintenance fund could pay for any minor repairs. The damages are not minor, I said, and I've already taken notes for insurance purposes. Insurance, her smug exterior cracked a little. There's no necessity to get insurance companies involved. I don't agree. My policy includes vandalism and trespassing accidents. Eleanor's eyes grew narrower. You're making a big error, Alex. My husband golfs with half the neighborhood. People won't enjoy this pettiness. Is that a threat? I spoke quietly. She emitted a brittle laugh. Of course, not, simply a friendly reminder that communities work best when individuals are reasonable. As she moved away, I called out after her Wednesday 5 p.m. After that, the vehicles are regarded as abandoned. Under Section 7.4 of the HOA covenants. Eleanor stood stock still for an instant before going on retreat, phone all ready to her ear. That night I got a call from Marlowe. There was panic in his voice. Whatever you're doing, stop now. The board are meeting tonight to consider this affair. Too late, I said calmly. Everything is set for tomorrow. What are you actually plotting? Marlowe's voice shook. I smiled to myself, just exercising my rights under the covenants. The same covenants you chose to enforce selectively to enable 57 vehicles to damage my property. Be reasonable. I've been more than reasonable. I cut you short. You have until 5 p.m. tomorrow to take those vehicles out. After that, things get interesting. I hung up and kept getting ready. The security company had completed installing temporary cameras around my meadow. The auction website was up pending activation. The portable fencing would arrive at dawn as darkness fell. I sat on my back porch observing fireflies emerge from what was left of my meadow. For the first time since Saturday, I felt calm. Eleanor and the HOA board had misjudged me, believing I would roll over and acquiesce to their sense of entitlement as law. They were about to learn otherwise. Wednesday morning broke with thick fog rolling off the lake, enveloping my property in ghostly white. I drank coffee on my porch as the crew installed portable fencing around each of the abandoned vehicles. They worked efficiently, finishing the job before most of Meadowbrook's citizens had even had a chance to finish their breakfast. My phone vibrated with a text from Marlowe Board emergency meeting at 4 p.m. Your attendance asked, I answered simply. Juanidianoros Kitinatun. Vehicles on my meadow, I politely nodded at each of them, continuing work, staging a tiny podium along the property line at 2:37 p.m. A black Lexus skidded to a stop at my curb. A young man in expensive apparel leaped out, sprinting to the blue fence Porsche. Hey, that's my car, he cried, shaking the fence. What's going on? I strolled over, peacefully, clipboard in hand. Are you James Winters? Yeah, he replied, perplexity overshadowing anger. How did you know your vehicle details are filed with the DMV? I showed him the notice. This car had been parked illegally on private property for more than 96 hours. The notice specifically stated it must be taken away by 5 p.m. Today, James tousled his hair. Look, I just returned from my dad's cabin. I didn't know there was any notice. Maybe you should have thought about the repercussions before leaving your car on another person's property after an unauthorized party, I said gently. So unlock the fence and I'll relocate it immediately, he said. For his keys, I glanced at my watch. I'm afraid not until after 5 p.m. Why, his face reened. That doesn't make any sense. The legal notice time expires at 5 p.m. Until then, things remain as is. This is ridiculous. James pulled out his phone. I'm calling Sophia's mom. She'll get this sorted out. Please do. I said, going back to my preparations in 20 minutes, Eleanor's Mercedes hurtled up my driveway. She stepped out looking like a thundercloud designer, glasses pushed up above her head, phone held firmly in her manicured hand. What is this? She fumed, nodding at the fenced cars. James insists you won't let him have his car. The notices were quite plain, I responded, still setting chairs out alongside the podium. All cars need to be taken off by 5 p.m., or they will be deemed abandoned. Eleanor's eyes grew large as she took in the signs for the auction. I was staging an auction. You can't be serious, completely serious. I checked section 7.4 of the covenants you're so keen on enforcing, whereby I can control abandoned vehicles at my discretion. This is outrageous. Eleanor's voice broke into a shriek that sent nearby birds fleeing. These are worth cars that belong to key individuals. I dropped a pile of auction paddles. Key individuals who broke onto private property and left their vehicles for days. Actions have ramifications, Eleanor. She edged closer, dropping her voice to a threatening whisper. My husband will sue you to bankruptcy for what I requested courteously, according to the precise HOA rules you used on me. I have proof of all the illegal easement, the property destruction, the abandoned cars, the adequate notice. I complied with all that was legally required. Eleanor's expression twisted with anger. She yanked out her phone once more, wildly dialing Marlowe, get over here right now, and bring Sheriff Davis, while Eleanor walked around and made progressively more desperate phone calls. I completed my preparations. A small refreshment table was arranged close to the podium. The auction site featured countdown clocks for every vehicle. Security cameras captured everything from several angles by 4:30 p.m. A crowd had formed. Neighbors I hardly spoke to hung around the peripheries of my compound, whispering amongst themselves. A number of teenagers clung to James, who stood woefully beside the fence. Enclosing his Porsche, Marlowe came with 4 other members of the board, all with serious-looking faces ranging from outrage to embarrassment. They clustered around Eleanor, darting nervous looks in my direction. The sheriff is on his way, Marlowe stated, moving toward me with assumed confidence. This has gone far enough, Alex. I couldn't agree more, I said. It went too far when 57 vehicles were routed onto my property without authorization. We can talk about compensation for damages, he provided, dropping his voice. But this auction has to be canceled immediately. The auction starts at 6 p.m. I told him firmly, unless, of course, the cars are taken out prior to 5 p.m. Marlowe checked his watch. That is just 25 minutes from now. Then I would advise you to move them, I told him. Sensibly, we can't. Eleanor interrupted, becoming part of our dialogue. The towing firm can't arrive until 5:30, and the other owners are still driving back from different locations. I shrugged. Not my problem. You caused this problem when you instructed people to park on my land without asking. Sheriff Davis's patrol vehicle arrived at exactly 4:45 p.m. The crowd parted as he walked up, notebook already in hand. I knew him from community functions but had never actually spoken with him directly. Afternoon people, he said, looking between me and the increasingly restless board members, received a report regarding some sort of dispute. Eleanor intervened before I could say anything. This individual is attempting to steal our children's vehicles. It's totally illegal. Sheriff Davis turned to me with elevated eyebrows. These cars have been left abandoned on my private property after an unauthorized gathering, I explained patiently. I've given P. damaged copies of the notices and dated pictures showing when each notice was posted. Sheriff Davis went over the materials slowly as Eleanor seethed next to him. This is ridiculous, she finally erupted. These are our children's cars. Tell him he can't do this. The sheriff looked up from my paperwork. Ma'am, as far as what I'm observing here, the property owner has done things right. The cars are indeed on private property without permission, but the HOA approved it. Eleanor persisted, actually. I interrupted, producing the piece of paper she'd held over my head last Saturday. This supposed easement does not hold. She needed my signature as homeowner, which it did not possess. And interestingly, today, when I called the office of the HOA, they showed no record that there was so-called official meeting to allow this. Sheriff Davis addressed himself to Marlowe. Is that true? Marlowe's face turned whiter. There had been perhaps procedural oversights. Procedural oversights, I repeated incredulously. You let 57 cars intrude on my property on a forged document. Eleanor's daughter, Sophia, elbowed through the crowd, tears streaming down her face. Please don't sell James's car. His dad will kill him and he'll break up with me. The crowd had increased in size with additional neighbors coming to see. The spectacle phones were out recording everything. I saw Mrs. Parker, who authors the community newsletter, making notes at 4:58 p.m. Marlowe grabbed me off to the side, his voice struggling to be heard. Name. Your price to end this insanity. I stared at him intently. This is not a matter of money. It's about respect for other people's property and respect for the rules that apply to everyone. The auction site featured on my tablet indicated the countdown, 1 minute left before bidding would open up. The first lot, a 2023 Porsche 911 in sapphire blue opening. Bid $50,000. Eleanor took my arm, her impeccably manicured nails biting into my skin. You can't do this to us. Do you know who we are in this town? I pushed her hand away firmly. I know perfectly well who you are. Eleanor, the question is, do you? The clock read 5 p.m. and a gentle chime rang out from my tablet as the auction countdown timed out. Sheriff Davis glanced at his watch. It's 5 p.m. What next? Every eye in the increasing crowd looked toward me, anticipating what I would do next. Your cars are going to be auctioned. I sent my neighbor a picture of the notice of auction. My phone blew up instantly with frantic calls from Eleanor, which I disregarded as I watched her dash across her impeccably manicured lawn in my direction by Tuesday afternoon. Rumors swirled through Pinterest Heights like furious hornets. I was standing sorting mail when Eleanor stormed up to me, her designer sunglasses shoved up into her highlighted hair. What do you think you're doing? She shouted, waving her phone in my face. Those notices better come down immediately. That's my daughter's boyfriend's new Porsche, and the rest belong to board members' kids. I calmly completed getting my envelopes in order before saying, in fact, I'm doing just what your HOA handbook suggests. Page 37, Section 4. B. Addressing abandoned vehicles on private property. Eleanor's face turned an interesting shade of purple. Abandoned, they've only been there 2 days, and they got proper notice yesterday. The rules state 24 hours. I even laminated the warnings so the morning dew wouldn't ruin them. I held my phone with the photos of every notice placement. Would you like to see the timestamps? This is outrageous. You know who I am in this community. Exactly why you should know rules better than anyone. I responded, I've taken pictures of everything. The tire tracks through my flower beds, the beer bottles in my koi pond, even the instant you had that red BMW pull over next to my oak tree. Eleanor's confidence was shaken a little. Marlowe won't allow this to happen. Marlowe doesn't own my land. I spoke with my lawyer this morning, who found it interesting that temporary easements were given without legal documentation. What Eleanor didn't know was that I'd spent the previous afternoon Phoning in favors, my college friend Sarah now had a thriving auction business dealing in luxury goods. My nephew Tyler, who graduated with a degree in media studies, assisted with rigging up 4 live stream cameras trained on the cars. My brother-in-law, who had a security firm, installed temporary fencing that would be arriving at dawn. Eleanor stormed off, furiously texting while she walked. I noticed she kept glancing back at my property, likely wondering if I was bluffing. I wasn't. That evening, I received emails confirming everything was set. The portable fencing would arrive at 5 a.m. The auction website would go live at noon. Security personnel would monitor the property boundaries starting at 6 a.m. I'd even hired a professional appraiser to document each vehicle's condition with photographs proof against any damage claims at dinner. I scanned social media, and it was abuzz with rumor. Pinterest Heights private group, several neighbors I'd never. One water which he declined, enforcing rules their HOA created. This isn't how we handle things here. And how do you handle things? By letting board members take advantage of everyone else. I pulled out my property survey. See this line? Everything beyond it is mine. Yet somehow 57 cars accumulated there. Without me asking, Marlowe massaged his temples. What's it going to take to resolve this quietly? No quiet about this anymore. I replied, displaying him my telephone. The story got out to 3 nearby Facebook forums. People are exhausted from double requirements. The board meets tomorrow at 4 p.m. Please delay until then. I shook my head. The notices state 5 p.m. Wednesday. The auction begins at 6. That should give you lots of time to relocate the cars or what you'll actually sell at teenagers. Portia. Marlowe looked truly worried. Guess we'll see, I said, opening the door. I'm curious myself. After he departed, I checked my security cameras. 2 individuals with flashlights were checking out the notices on the windshields. I zoomed in. Eleanor's daughter and a boy I thought was the Porsche owner. They snapped pictures, talked excitedly, then rushed off just after 2 a.m. My backyard motion sensors were activated. Someone was trying to hotwire one of the cars. I called the police and reported attempted theft on my property. When officers arrived, the individual had left, but now I had official records of nighttime disturbances at dawn. Everything changed. The fencing company arrived right on time for workers, quietly offloaded metal barriers, forming a perfect rectangle around the vehicles. Security cameras captured Eleanor standing in her window phone, pressed to her ear by 10 a.m. Professional signs had been posted. Illegal car auction. 6 o'clock today, the auction site launched at noon, with in-depth pictures of all vehicles. Within an hour, 50 individuals had signed up as possible biders. My phone rang nonstop. I let all go to voicemail. The HOA official email sent 3 more and more desperate messages, the last one threatening to cancel my membership privileges at 2 p.m. A local news van parked across the street at 3 p.m. Marlowe texted that the emergency board meeting had been advanced at 4 p.m. The first curious neighbors started showing up near my property line. Can they actually do this? I overheard someone asking my cousin's lawyer. He says, if they followed notification procedures, absolutely. Another replied at 4:30 p.m. I stepped onto my porch and took in the scene. The auction podium had been brought, the portable fence shone in the sun. 7 luxury cars waited their owners, nowhere to be found. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah online. Bidding already at $7,500 for the Porsche. This is going to be crazy. I smiled and glanced at my watch. 30 minutes until showtime. Stop this auction. At once, Eleanor's voice rang out the hum of the crowd gathering. She walked towards me with Marlowe and 4 other members of the HOA board, their faces contorted in anger and fear. Behind them, a cluster of teenagers standing together, including Eleanor's daughter Zoe, whose makeup was streaked from tears. I stood behind a table set up with lemonade and cookies, welcoming neighbors who had gathered to witness the drama. My laptop showcased the auction site, where more than 120 individuals were registered to bid. Welcome to the hood party, I stated with a smile. Refreshments. You find this amusing? Eleanor shoved through 2 security guards, her high-end heels sinking into the grass. These are our children's vehicles. I've called the sheriff, and you'll be sorry when he arrives. I'm glad you called him, I stated, glancing at my watch. He can ensure everything goes legally. You're just in time. The auction is in 20 minutes. A small group had congregated behind the fence, some neighbors taking pictures with their phones. I saw Mrs. Jenkins from across the street who'd complained about Eleanor's music for years, but was always dismissed. This woman is attempting to steal our children's property, Eleanor declared to the spectators. She's gone totally nuts, actually. I yelled loud enough so everybody could hear. I'm merely going by the steps listed in the HOA handbook, which you specifically endorsed last year. I waved around a paper with Eleanor's yellow highlighted signature section 4B concerning autos abandoned on private property without authority. Marlowe took a step forward, attempting to seem reasonable. Look, we know you're angry over the party. Maybe we can talk about reimbursement for anything damaged. We're long beyond that point. I mentioned I attempted to discuss this yesterday when I found 57 cars parked on my property without permission, I was told, and I quote, nothing you can do about it. A murmur ran through the crowd. But these are children's cars, protested another board member, a slender man named Gregory, who owned the local insurance agency. That makes it all the more surprising that adults would encourage them to park illegally. I said a sheriff's cruiser arrived and Deputy Rodriguez got out, Lou. Bidding already at $7,500 for the Porsche. This is going to be crazy. I smiled and glanced at my watch. 30 minutes until showtime. Stop this auction. At once, Eleanor's voice rang out the hum of the crowd gathering. She walked towards me with Marlowe and 4 other members of the HOA board, their faces contorted in anger and fear behind them. A cluster of teenagers standing together, including Eleanor's daughter Zoe, whose makeup was streaked from tears. I stood behind a table set up with lemonade and cookies, welcoming neighbors who had gathered to witness the drama. My laptop showcased the auction site, where more than 120 individuals were registered to bid. Welcome to the hood party, I stated with a smile. Refreshments. You find this amusing? Eleanor shoved through 2 security guards, her high-end heels sinking into the grass. These are our children's vehicles. I've called the sheriff, and you'll be sorry when he arrives. I'm glad you called him, I stated, glancing at my watch. He can ensure everything goes legally. You're just in time. The auction is in 20 minutes. A small group had congregated behind the fence, some neighbors taking pictures with their phones. I saw Mrs. Jenkins from across the street who'd complained about Eleanor's music for years, but was always dismissed. This woman is attempting to steal our children's property, Eleanor declared to the spectators. She's gone totally nuts, actually, I yelled loud enough so everybody could hear. I'm merely going by the steps listed in the HOA handbook, which you specifically endorsed last year. I waved around a paper with Eleanor's yellow highlighted signature section 4B concerning autos abandoned on private property. Without authority, Marlowe took a step forward, attempting to seem reasonable. Look, we know you're angry over the party. Maybe we can talk about reimbursement for anything damaged. We're long beyond that point. I mentioned I attempted to discuss this yesterday when I found 57 cars parked on my property without permission, I was told, and I quote, nothing you can do about it. A murmur ran through the crowd. But these are children's cars, protested another board member, a slender man named Gregory who owned the local insurance agency. That makes it all the more surprising that adults would encourage them to park illegally. I said a sheriff's cruiser arrived and Deputy Rodriguez got out, looking confused at the scene. Eleanor rushed over right away. Thank goodness you're here. This woman is attempting to steal 7 cars. Deputy Rodriguez came over slowly. Ma'am, can you tell me what's going on here? I handed him a folder with copies of everything my property deed, with limits well defined. The forged easement document, photos of the cars, with timestamp warnings and prints of the HOA regulations for abandoned vehicles. These cars were parked on my private property during an unauthorized party. I explained calmly in accordance with HOA procedures. I posted notices allowing owners 24 hours to remove them. That deadline came and went at 5 p.m. Today the deputy studied the documents thoroughly while Eleanor seethed beside him. She's bending the rules, Eleanor insisted. No one really enforces that section. So the rules only matter to some people. I asked naively. Deputy Rodriguez looked up from the documents. These notices seem in order, and this is clearly private property according to the survey. But she can't just sell other individuals' cars. Eleanor's voice had reached a remarkable pitch. Actually, the deputy said, under state law, after proper notification, abandoned property can be sold to cover storage and removal costs. Eleanor's face turned alarmingly red. These aren't abandoned, The kids were coming to get them after the 5 p.m. deadline. I pointed out, I have security footage of someone trying to remove a vehicle at 2 a.m. without permission, which required police response for attempted theft. Deputy Rodriguez nodded. I saw that report. Zoe forced her way past the adult's mascara streaming down her face. Please don't sell Jason's Porsche. His dad will kill him, and he'll dump me. We didn't know she'd get crazy about some dumb grass. I couldn't help feeling sorry for the girl, but remembered my ruined flower beds and the coish that had floated dead after the party. The auction begins in 10 minutes. I blew the starting bid on the Porsche to $15,000. This created a new wave of hysteria. Jason tall kid in a Letterman jacket being shoved forward. That's worth less than half of what it is. My dad only just got it last month. Then maybe he should have shown you how to respect someone else's belongings. I offered. Marlo grabbed my arm and pulled me in close, speaking in a whisper. Now this has gone far enough. What do you actually want? Precisely what I wanted yesterday. Responsibility, name your price. He spat. We can write you a check immediately. It's not money, then what revenge you'll ruin, relationships for some tire marks. I looked him straight in the eyes. It's about justice for 3 years. I've seen Eleanor receive special treatment. Face changed when he saw that this had grown so much larger than an issue over parking. Meanwhile, Eleanor had proceeded to the fence where she was desperately attempting to persuade the security guard to allow her inside to sell the cars. I'm sorry, ma'am, he replied affirmatively. I can only receive orders from the owner of the property. The site on my computer indicated that bidding had opened early. The red BMW was at $12,000. The Porsche was up to $23,500. Eleanor's husband, David, came stepping out of his Range Rover with a guy in a designer suit who I presumed was their attorney. They confided with Marlo now and then shooting looks in my direction. Zoe approached me once again, this time not with her crew. My mom says you're just jealous because you live by yourself and don't have any children, she whispered. But that's not it. Is it? I was surprised by her understanding. No, it's not. Is there anything that can be done? Please, Jason had saved for months to enable his dad to purchase the car for the first time. I hesitated. The girl seemed really upset, unlike the mother who was now shouting at the lawyer for failing to immediately fix the issue. Deputy Rodriguez got back on his cruiser. I've spoken to my supervisor. All seems to be legally sound, but he recommends settling this difference prior to the auction going forward. Eleanor's attorney came along with Marlo and David. My client is willing to negotiate fair compensation for damages, he said formally, and a fitting reaction to the unauthorized Niesman falsification, I added. The attorney blinked, obviously having not been informed of that information. 5 minutes to auction, called Sarah from the back of the podium. The crowd had swelled 3. A greater number of news vans had come down the block. Eleanor's face had blanched out from red to pale as she realized this was actually taking place. Marlo glanced at his phone and paused. The Porsche bid is now up to $30,000 less than Blue Book value. I indicated, but the bids are rising rapidly. David finally looked directly at me. What will it take to get this stopped right now? Close the bidding, Eleanor shrieked, her face growing red as the Porsche's price rose to $45,000 on the internet. The group of curious neighbors who'd assembled to witness the show murmured with excitement. I pretended not to hear her and nodded to the auctioneer to continue. I can have you arrested, she threatened. Grabbing my arm, the sheriff firmly took her hand from my sleeve. Ma'am, please don't make this worse off for yourself, he muttered gently. Touching someone without consent would be classed as assault. Eleanor's daughter cried hysterically into her phone. Daddy, come home immediately, they're selling Tyler's car. I nodded to the auctioneer to call a 10-minute break. Let's speak inside, I said, my voice calm, despite the pounding in my chest. This was going better than I'd intended. My living room seemed cramped, with the 7 of them squeezed onto my furnishings. The air conditioner fought the summer heat, and their combined indignation. Eleanor would not sit pacing by my fireplace, while Marlo nervously checked his watch. You're having your fun, aren't you? Eleanor spat her designer handbag clutched to her bosom. Indeed I am not, I said honestly. I'd rather be working on my garden that your guest trashed, but here we are. I pushed a folder across my coffee table. Within were 3 plain typed pages and lots of empty space for signatures. My terms are simple. I explained first the HOA acknowledges in writing that they erroneously granted permission to use my land without permission and pays for all damage about $7,800 for landscaping work, koi replacement, and restoration of the meadow. Marlo began to protest, but I held up my hand. I have before and after pictures and 3 estimates from landscapers. The figures are reasonable. Second, Eleanor steps down off the board immediately. Her seat falls to someone elected in the proper manner, not one appointed by friends. Eleanor's gasp was theatrical enough for a soap opera. Never have I served on that board for 9 years. 9 years of bending rules for you and punishing others for slight offenses. I confronted Mrs. Johnson on the other side of the street, was fined $500 for having the wrong color of white trim. But you had a party with live bands until 2 a.m. without permits. The sheriff who'd followed us into the house nodded slightly. He'd been called in regards to the noise that night. And third, I put the HOA bylaws get updated to mandate written permission of every property owner first, before any of their land will be utilized for any purpose. No more word-of-mouth agreements that somehow come about when an individual is out through the window. I was seeing more vehicles turning up, parents of teenagers whose cars sat in my makeshift car lot. One guy in a suit looking at his son's BMW, his phone held to his ear as he shook his head angrily. "You have no right," Eleanor began, but Marlo interrupted her. "What happens if we say no?" He inquired. She looked at it and her face paled. "Tyler's dad is threatening to sue us in person," she whispered to Marlo. "He's a corporate attorney." For the first time, cracks showed in her flawless facade. Her hands shook as she put down her phone. The doorbell rang, and then loud banging through the peephole I saw at least 5 furious parents on my porch. I turned around to the board members. "Decision time," I said. "I can open that door and tell them why their kids' cars are being auctioned, or you can sign these documents," and I stopped the auction right away. Marlo put out his hand to take a pen. "How do we know that you'll call it off? Because like it or not." "I'm a man of my word," I said. "The sheriff is our witness." Eleanor's mascara running down her face as she stood by Marlo to sign. "This is blackmail," she murmured. "No," the sheriff interrupted. "This is consequences. There's a huge difference." The knocking increased in volume. Someone was calling Eleanor's name. "Outside sign," or "Don't sign," I said. Glancing at my watch, but within 5 minutes that Porsche is owned by someone in Michigan, cameras flashed when Eleanor presented me with a large check for $7,800 on my front lawn. Our local newspaper reporter took furious notes while neighbors observed from across the street. Everyone in Pinehurst Heights had already heard of the near auction by now. "Smile, Eleanor," I whispered, gritting my teeth. "It's great to be a good sport when you lose." Her daggers shot from her eyes, but she forced a stiff smile in front of the camera. The headline would read, "HOA settles dispute after unauthorized use of private property." I'd made sure of that by inviting the press myself. "This is just the beginning," Eleanor hissed as soon as the photographer turned away. "You've made powerful enemies." I accepted the check calmly. "Actually, I've just enforced rules that should have been followed all along. That's hardly making enemies behind us." Workers were already replanting my damaged garden beds. The tire marks across my meadow would take longer to fix, but the koi pond was being refilled today. I'd insisted that repairs start at once as a part of the agreement. That night, my doorbell rang out of the blue. I opened it to see Eleanor's husband James standing uncertainly on my porch alone, without his wife. "May I come in?" he said softly. "There's something you need to know." I paused but ushered him in. He declined coffee and sat stiffly on the edge of my couch. Eleanor didn't inform me what she'd done until the auction had commenced. He explained, gazing at his hands. "I wish to apologize personally. Our daughter's birthday wasn't worth harming someone's property." His sincerity left me astounded. "Thank you," I said matter-of-factly. "There's more," he went on. "Eleanor's been using HOA funds to redesign portions of our house, categorizing personal expenses as community improvements. That's why she struggled so hard to remain on the board." My mouth dropped open. "That's against the law." "Yes," he nodded somberly, "and once the new board reviews the books, which they will, it'll all come out. I've been trying to persuade her to give back the money before that occurs." 2 weeks later, I got a formal invitation to show up at the emergency HOA meeting the community center. Was abuzz with tension as I sat down. Almost every homeowner had come after hearing rumors of financial impropriety. Retired Judge Thomas Hamilton, who'd been voted in to replace Eleanor, opened the meeting after our financial audit. We found about $42,000 in embezzled funds over the last 3 years. Gasps ran through the crowd and someone in the back yelled, "Where's Eleanor?" "Mrs. Coleman has resigned from the community entirely," Hamilton announced. "Her husband has reimbursed all misused funds with interest, and they've listed their home for sale." I spotted James slipping in through the side door, looking exhausted. Our eyes met briefly, and he gave me a small nod of acknowledgement. After the meeting, several neighbors who'd previously ignored me stopped to chat. Mrs. Johnson from across the street hugged me tightly. "You stood up to her when none of us had the guts to," she whispered to her. 6 months earlier, my refurbished property was where the Pinehurst Heights summer picnic took place. My once battered meadow was full of wildflowers, and kids were playing tag around the new gazebo I'd constructed near the lake. The HOA had voted unanimously to call it Community Outlook, a little joke about keeping a close eye out. Marlowe arrived with 2 lemonades. He'd still been on the board, but was now an improbable ally in revitalizing our community regulations. "You wouldn't believe the difference in this place," he grinned, handing me one property. "Values are higher, complaints are lower, and for the first time we had more volunteers than jobs for the garden committee. Wonderful thing that can happen when folks feel they're being dealt with evenly." I responded as sunset colored the lake in gold. A recognizable Porsche drove into my drive. Eleanor's girl Zoe emerged, no longer the weeping teenage